So today we're talking about hating your mama.
Wow. Well, we're going to unpack a whole bunch of like mini parables in this one, all about the cost of being a disciple of Jesus. So that's what we're talking about today on HC Daily.
You're listening to another episode of HC Daily, a daily devotional podcast that you can listen to at home or on the go. We believe that you can grow as much as you want to grow spiritually, and this podcast can be a part of your daily growth plan. So, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify, or your favorite podcast app, we're glad you're here. Now, let's join our hosts, Jeff Forrester and Chris Zarbaugh, in the studio.
So, Chris, last week you asked me a really amazing question that people were excited to hear, and that was about how I proposed to my wife.
Oh, yeah, I did.
Yeah. So I thought I would turn the tables and ask the same question, because this is the last podcast you and I are going to do together in HC Daily before we switch over to the Daily Bible Guys.
Right.
And Wesley's going to join you next week, which is going to be really cool. But this is the last one. And so you've never told this story on air, right, to our listeners. So
yeah. So I never
How
have.
did you propose? And is it amazing to you that Liz said yes? Because it's amazing to me.
Yeah, it is amazing. I took her to, we grew up in Youngstown, Ohio. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is right across the border, only quite literally 40 minutes away from our house. So I took her to Pittsburgh, Three Rivers, and I took her up an incline. So, like an incline where you jump on the thing and it goes all the way up the hill. And I took her to the Needlepoint Rotating Restaurant, appropriately titled Christopher's.
Wow.
And then we ate a really fancy dinner, came down the incline, and when we get off the incline, I had Clydesdale horse carriage waiting for us.
Wow.
When we opened the door, I had it filled with dozens and dozens and dozens of roses everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so then we climbed in there, and of course at this point she sort of knew it was coming.
Yeah.
And then we traveled around Pittsburgh, and then we went to Three Rivers, right outside of a restaurant called the Grand Concourse, very fancy. And I reminded her that a year earlier that summer, she had made a comment and said, I bet you this is a really cool place where a lot of people propose. She said because...
Oh, she was sending signals then.
Well, probably, yeah. But she was saying...
You did precisely what she wanted. She planted that seed a year earlier.
Right. Mm-hmm. And she had said, this looks like a good proposing spot. This is really pretty. Mm-hmm. So I took her back to that spot.
Wow.
And so then I dropped on one knee. And when I did so... of course, it's really busy. So we got about maybe a dozen people that sort of stopped. Mm-hmm. And so, there was like one, I knew she was going to say yes, but I was hoping it was going to be like a grand yes, because I'm thinking, people are watching,
Right.
So I dropped one knee, gave her a speech. And of course, she said yes. Everybody clapped. And then we got in my car. Actually, it was my dad's fancy SS Monte Carlo car. And I played for her, strangely enough, a song from Disney that talked about her being my queen.
See, this was an amazing story until you did the Disney stuff.
Well, we're super Disney fans.
Yeah.
But it says,
when did you propose? Like in the 90s?
Will you be my queen? That's what it says.
Okay.
So anyway, so I did that, and then and that was it. And then we went home, and it was pretty wonderful. So she knew it was coming.
Wow.
And I thought it was a surprise, because I thought even when I asked her, like, hey, let's get in the car and let's go. I thought that I'd done everything I could to disguise it, but she knew the entire time.
She knew the whole time.
Even before I picked her up.
Yeah, well, she'd already told you where she wanted to get engaged. So as soon as you started heading that direction, she knew it was happening.
She also knew it was coming that summer. I was in college, so it had to happen in that 3-month window somewhere.
Yeah.
So I guess if you're going to a fancy restaurant, right?
So she's a puppet master, and you just dance to her tune. That's what it is. Wow. Well, hey, that's a really sweet story. I mean, it's not Olive Garden or nothing. You didn't get unlimited breadsticks, did you?
Right.
But I mean, if that's the best you could do, Chris, I'm sure that was enough.
It was sweet.
Wow.
It was really sweet.
Wow, that's nice. Okay. Well, how sweet was that?
Yeah.
Just gives us warm fuzzies. We're so happy.
Well, it's better than Jim and Pam on The Office, where Jim knelt down at a gas station in the rain.
Hey, well, whatever.
So, and that was what the world considered super romantic, I guess. Right? And I'm saying I trump that.
Yeah. Oh, you're all over it. Yeah,
Yes.
That's right. You nailed it. Good for you. You make the rest of us look bad. Okay. So we're talking today to pivot, and I have no transitional statement for that. We're just going to go right into talking now that you're done. Luke chapter 14. Verse 25 is where we're going to read. I'm reading from the New Living Translation, and Jesus is going to unpack like 3 or 4. Like they're not parables. They're just illustrations. But the idea of a parable is that you take an earthly illustration and be able to give a heavenly meaning to it. And so what he does, he gives these little mini statements with heavenly meaning. So here you go. Here's what it says. A large crowd was following Jesus, and he turned around and said to them, if you want to be my disciple, you must, by comparison, hate everyone else. Your father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you cannot be my disciple. And if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. But don't begin until you count the cost. For who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money, and then everyone would laugh at you. They'd say, there's the person who started that building, couldn't afford to finish it. Or, what king would go to war against another king without first sitting down with his counselors to discuss whether his enemy of 10,000 could defeat the 20,000 soldiers marching against him? And if he can't, he'll send a delegation to discuss terms of peace while the enemy is still far away. So, you cannot become my disciple without giving up everything you own. Salt is good for seasoning, but if it loses its flavor, how do you make it salty again? Flavorless salt is good neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It's thrown away. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand.
Yeah, so counting the cost.
Counting the cost is what it's all about.
Yeah, so, and by the way, how would you say, I think I know the answer to this, but you said, well, they're not parables. So what constitutes a parable versus just an illustration?
I don't know.
Well, I
don't think I've ever even thought of that before.
Yeah, well, I thought that a parable was something that was fictional, and yet it was almost like a metaphor. Where Jesus said a certain man went down, and what he's doing is he's telling he's telling a story. He's telling a story.
A widow went to the unjust judge and kept praying and praying and asking and asking.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for me, it always felt more like he said it as a matter of fact, and yet all he's really doing is drawing a lesson out of it, as opposed to saying like, well, let me tell you something about counting the cost. A man doesn't do this, does he?
Right. Yeah.
Which should be like an illustration to me.
Good. So these are more illustrations.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
And I would also say,
I totally agree.
Yeah, and I would also say that the illustrations that he uses here are pretty incredible.
Yeah.
We don't fight wars, but if you think about it, everybody knew. Back then conquering territory was so common.
Oh yeah.
That if you used an illustration about 10,000 soldiers preparing to go against 20,000 soldiers, everybody would be like, "Yeah, nobody does that."
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then of course building a house and not being able to finish it.
Well, let's unpack the most glaring thing, the most shocking, because kings fighting wars, people building buildings, we get those things.
Right.
But the most shocking one is, if you want to be my disciple, you must, by comparison, hate everyone else.
Yeah.
How is this something Jesus would say? Because isn't Jesus the guy who just says we're supposed to love God and love people? And Jesus is always talking about loving other people. It's not about you. It's about putting other people first. How in the world now does he say, okay, well, if you want to be my disciple, you have to hate people?
Well, keep in mind the operative word is by comparison. So Jesus isn't calling us to hate our mother and father. He's saying by comparison, it will seem like hate compared to our total love and devotion for God. What he's saying is there's such a gap. There needs to be such a gap between our love for God and our love for people. And so therefore it is like hate in comparison, because that's how much more our devotion should be toward God. And then he goes on and says, before you follow me, count the cost. And because he's saying, take up your cross and follow me, well, everybody knew what that meant.
Yeah.
Right? Somebody carries their cross up to Calvary. We hear the word cross and we think religious symbols. They hear the word cross and they think of death, crucifixion, one of the worst torturous, executions devised by Romans.
Can you imagine if first century Romans showed up and saw girls walking around with crosses on their neck? It would be like us 100 years from now and seeing people walk around with electric chairs around their neck.
Guillotines.
Yeah, guillotines.
Or something like that. It'd be like, why?
Firing squad.
Why are they doing that, right?
Yeah.
So when he says, pick up your cross and follow me, what he's really saying is your love has to be so great in order for you to be willing to pick up your cross, that love is going to be so great, it's going to seem like hate in comparison to how much you love anybody else.
Right.
And so that's why he says by comparison.
Yeah.
And so I think that, it's interesting because I think I've said this once before, but I'll say it again. My good friend Josh Eisenhart when we were in high school. I think he was 18, 17 years old. And he said, I think God wants me to go into full-time ministry. And we were at this camp, and I pulled him aside in the prayer tent and I said, I don't think you understand what you're saying, because ministry is a tough gig.
Yeah.
And when you dedicate your whole life to ministry, you're going to have to sacrifice a lot. And to be quite honest with you, I sort of view it like taking up your cross. Like you're taking up a whole different kind of cross, right? Because your whole life now is this or that. So anyway, I tried to talk him out of it. And I just said, the only way you should go into ministry is if you feel like God will not allow you to do anything else. And of course, then he did. And he was a pastor with me for 20 years. But anyway, all that to say, Jesus lays out that following him is not easy.
Yeah, right.
Right? So what would you say to that?
Well, we're shocked because most of the time we come to Jesus because many times we feel guilty about our sins, so we want our sins forgiven. How great is this? He forgives my sins. I'm going to feel better if I trust Jesus. And then a lot of times we come to Jesus because we want him to fix stuff. We want him to fix our marriage or fix our finances. And so we come to Jesus because of all the benefits. And then we find out Jesus said, well, if you want to be my disciple, it's going to cost you something. It's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. The note here, we love the Life Application Study Bible. We mention this all the time. Nobody gives us any money for it. Hey, Tyndale, you should give us money for this. We're always promoting it. But I love it. And by the way, if you don't have a study Bible, go buy a study Bible.
Yeah.
He always tells you, hey, just Google it. I never recommend anybody Google.
You got to find the right.
Because how do you discern what's good and bad, right? If you don't really know.
Right.
But the Life Application Study Bible, I think I bought this one as hardcover. I bought it on Amazon for like $30, right? But the notes, what's really cool is you're reading along, and verse 27 says, "And if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple." Well, next to it, there's a spot that has some cross references that give you other places to read about that same idea, which is really cool. But down in the notes below, there's a note, and it says 14:27. And it just says, Jesus' audience was well aware of what it meant to carry one's cross. When the Romans led criminals to their execution sites, they were forced to carry the crosses on which they would die. This showed their submission to Rome and warned observers that they had better submit too. Jesus made this statement to get the crowds to think through their enthusiasm for him. He encouraged those who were superficial either to go deeper or to turn back. Following Jesus means totally submitting to him, perhaps even to the point of death.
Yeah.
That's incredible. So it's a sign of submission. They would take up their crosses, submitting to the fact that the Romans had total, absolute power over their life. And Jesus is saying, if you're going to follow me, you have to take up your cross, recognizing that God has total control of your life. It's not your own anymore. You're dying to yourself, and God's in total control. Yeah. It's a submission movement. And that's a surprise to people, because what we often are attracted to Jesus is the benefits we get. And Jesus is saying, actually, if you're going to follow me, it's 100% total submission to me. Yeah. And that's pretty hardcore.
Well, yeah. Well, the Apostle Paul says, nevertheless, I no longer live, but Jesus Christ lives within me.
Yeah, yeah.
And so when Jesus calls us to, give everything to him, he's not shy about it. In fact, even earlier in this series, we talked about, remember the pearl of great price? Selling everything you have to obtain the pearl of great price. Yeah. Buying the field that has treasure in it, selling everything you have. Jesus asks for nothing less than our all.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want some of our lives. He doesn't want most of our lives. He wants all of it. And so the question I always ask when I think about, this whole concept is, how much is enough, God? Like from a skeptical point of view, I ask the question, and I think it's a normal, honestly, not just skeptical, it's normal, to say, well, God, geez, how much do you really want from us? You only want our total obedience. You want us to respond to you financially. You want us to consider you before anything else, and every piece of advice on how we live our lives. How much is enough? And you know what the answer is? The answer is until you've given everything.
Yeah, yeah.
And the reason why is because God's worth it. He is the pearl of great price.
Right.
Right. He is the field with treasure in it. And he is worth our lives. And so Jesus is calling us on no uncertain terms to die for him. And even though that today in the 21st century, most of us are not going to have to give up our lives, but even during that time, all the 12 apostles, except for one, right?
Right.
Gave up their lives and they died.
Yeah.
Peter was crucified upside down. Mark was dragged behind a horse until he was dead, right? I mean, there's people who were beheaded. It was just unbelievable how people ended up dying for what they believed in.
Yeah. And that still happens today all around the world.
Right.
More martyrs per year, typically, or any decade in modern times than in Roman times, which is incredible. So Romans would have these very intense times of killing millions, but it would last for a few years, and then there'd be a change, or it would slow down. Then it just depended on who the emperors were and what the governors were doing in the areas. So over the course of the Roman Empire, there'd be 20 million people or whatever. Some estimates 8 million would be the other side of it. So somewhere there, millions. But it's not uncommon in any kind of century, 20th century. They say there's more Christian martyrs in the 20th century than there were in Rome, right? That's really incredible. So it happens all the time. I know many people who are risking their life on a daily basis to spread the gospel. That happens, but that's not what Jesus is calling our listeners to necessarily. He may. Who knows? We're always only one generation away from losing our freedoms. So you just never know what's going to happen in our culture, in our society today. So instead, what we do is he's inviting us to having a willingness for that. As a matter of fact, going back to that statement where you have to hate everybody else, he says, yes, even your own life. What he's saying is your love for him is so radical and so all-consuming that nothing else even appears to matter compared. Now, do your parents matter? Yes. The Bible commands us. It's one of the 10 commandments. I don't know if you knew that's one of God's top 10 to honor your father and your mother, right?
Which number is it?
One of God's favorite ones. It's number 5.
I think it's number 7.
Is it number 7? Yeah. Oh, now you're going to have to look it up.
Oh, of course I will. But keep going.
Yeah. It probably is number 7 now that I think about it. And of course we're supposed to love our brothers and our sisters. The Bible tells us that, and our wife and our children. Book of James says if you leave a heart in the heart of your wife, God's not going to hear your prayers. So of course God expects us to love them and treat them well. It's just that our value of God is so all-consuming, and our value of Christ is so primary that everything else is clearly secondary. And he says,
you were wrong. You were right. It was 5.
Was it 5?
I'm wrong.
So why did I listen to you? I let you talk me off of truth again.
Oh, 7 is the adultery one.
Oh, yeah.
I knew that stood out for some reason.
Okay, yeah, 7's a big one.
That's a big one.
Yeah, but I thought it was 5. Yeah. So, ding, ding. Do I get a point?
You
I should get a point.
Score 1 for Jeff.
Score 1 for Jeff. Yes. So, back to this. We're ruining this one. I don't know why. We've probably lost all our listeners at this point. But basically, it comes down to Jesus is challenging us to consider the cost. That's why he says, hey, man alive, you respect the fact that a king would sit down with his counselors and go, what is this going to cost us if we go to war against a bigger army? You respect a businessman who goes, who lays the plans and works out all the extra architectural stuff and then gets the bids so he knows precisely what it's going to take to finish this thing. And Jesus is saying, listen, you're entering into a battle. This is going to be tough. Do you have what it takes? Jesus is saying it's going to cost a lot, and it's going to be a lot of work, and there's big plans and a lot of strategies. Are you willing to go through all of this? Are you willing to sacrifice everything to get it done? And if so, Jesus says, man, we're going to go on this journey together, but there's a price. And then finally, remember how many times does he use the salt illustration?
Yeah.
And so here he throws it back out there again. Salt's good for seasoning, but if it loses its flavor, how do you make it salty again? You can't make it salty again. So Jesus is saying, don't get started and then stop. Just go all in with me.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, even though that, it doesn't necessarily for us translate, not necessarily into losing our lives or maybe selling everything we have or anything like that. But if you really, truly think about it, God demands nothing less than to consider him first above everything else.
Right.
So with every decision that I make, with every, choice that I make throughout my day, with every relationship, with every financial practice, with everything, in my attitude, in my responses, how I run my business, how I manage my relationships, God is asking you for all of it so that you would consider him first in his ways.
Yeah.
which may not seem like everything you own or giving your life. But if you think about it, it sort of is your life.
Right.
Because Jesus trumps every aspect of our lives.
Well, he's the author of your life.
Right.
He's the giver of your marriage. He's the giver of your children. He's the equipper for your job. He's the one who opened up all of the opportunities that have come in your life. God is the source of everything good. It's silly for a Christian to say God is my co-pilot.
Right.
God's not your co-pilot. God's not like, oh, good, I get to sit next to you in the seat. God's like, I'm going to drive your life. If you're going to be my follower, I'm driving your life. It's silly for us to say God is a major part of my life. Faith is such a major part of my life. God's like, I don't want to be a major part. That means there's a whole bunch of minor parts that aren't mine.
Mm-hmm.
God's like, I am your life. And everything, if you're going to really be a follower of me, you have to come to the point, a real disciple is going to come to the point, realize it all comes from me. And he's not being greedy. God knows the best part of your life is the best life you could possibly live is not fractured up all throughout the world, and that you just get to, man alive, if you can just on your own work out a little bit better relationship, and if you on your own could work out better kids. Instead, God's saying, listen, it all comes from me, and the best life you can have is in me, completely enveloped and surrounded by me, but it requires surrender. And that's why Jesus uses that phrase, carry your cross. You're submitting to his kingdom and who he is.
Yeah, so I guess a good word before we close would be, in what area of our lives are we holding back? Or what area in our lives are we sort of saying, God, you can't be a part of this, or you're not a part of this piece of the equation of my life. So if there is anything that God is challenging us with, just surrender every part of our lives to him.
Yeah, that's a good prayer today. God, it's all yours. I'm yours.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see you next time on HC Daily.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by liking this episode and sharing it on your social media platforms. Be sure to leave a comment and review, and don't forget to give us 5 stars. When you do, you help us reach even more people who need a daily devotional like HC Daily. If you'd like to hear more from Chris and Jeff, they're both teaching pastors at Heritage Church, located in Southeast Michigan. You can get more of their messages by clicking on the Messages tab at heritagechurch.com. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode of HC Daily.